Yes, I'm going to be looking at Guyana's land sovereignty this week, and next week I look at Guyana's exclusive economic zone, its sovereignty on the sea. So currently, the challenges to Guyana's land sovereignty date back to 1962. Present day, Venezuela in the east, Suriname on the west. These remain unresolved. But happily, the challenges have been largely confined to the status that uh, that existed at the time of independence in 1966. And I'll make at several points in this talk is that's a cause for celebration. And part of the conundrum, I think, is how come it has not led to building of more national feeling, more of a sense of national identity. Currently, the International Court of Justice is in the process of deciding whether it has jurisdiction on the matter of the controversy with Venezuela. Thanks to Zoom, I was able to look at that. I think many persons as well were able to look at the hearing, which began on the 30th of June. Of course, that hearing is about the 1899 final settlement, which was on the border land boundary with Venezuela, nothing about the maritime boundary. So what I propose to do in the next half hour is a quick gallop through some key moments and events from 1895 to the present, and then look at reflecting on what sovereignty means devoid of safeguards for public property. Sovereignty, of course, being ultimate political authority over a nation state and its public property. I look at this period, this century-long challenge to a settled border on our left, on Guyana's left, from Venezuela, and the half-century-long challenge from Suriname on the right, through the prism of trying to understand how come we have, in spite of these challenges, and in spite of the successful keeping of these external threats at bay, that there is more ethnic identity and less national identity. And my own reflections has to do with the lack of safeguards for public property that have led to this, failure to rally around the flag and rally around national identity. So here's a quick organizing framework. I'm not going to bore you with this, with details on the chronology. I use them as well just to keep myself in check. And I think the first decade, the decade 1895 to 1905, is really the start of our story in this webinar. And then, as in later times, Guyana is simply a useful pawn in geopolitical calculations. At that time, the calculations of the USA. But remarkably, by 1905, both the western and the southern borders of Guyana are settled through international arbitration. So here's a rather busy slide. The story begins in 1895. Venezuela asserts claims up to the left bank of the Essequibo River. At that time, Venezuela posits itself as if it were David against the Goliath of the United Kingdom. It's able to get, at the time, the support of the president of the USA, who invokes the Monroe Doctrine. For the US, as many writers have noted, it's a good pretext to assert American dominance over the Caribbean and Latin America. It's the beginning of the American century, 1895, and it establishes the USA part of this establishment of the USA as an international power. Of course, these are indigenous territories. And for Venezuela not only fails to prove its principal arguments, but then as now, there is no irredentist population located in the Essequibo region. No, the indigenous peoples, the Carib in particular, the Caribbean, detested the Venezuelans who were unbelievably cruel to them. And they never gave up their property, but they accepted British claims to sovereignty as the lesser of two evils. Events move quickly. Both the USA on behalf of Venezuela and the United Kingdom strike a boundary commission, separate commissions in 1896. A year later, those commissions are dissolved, and the two countries, Great Britain and Venezuela, signed a Treaty of Washington agreeing to go to international arbitration. This is very high level. We all know this in Guyana. Every school child learns this. And at the end of that, the tribunal was, the documents filled 23 printed volumes, 55 sessions in Paris, the very high level judges. At the end, this was the 1899 Arbitral Award, accepted by all parties as the full, final, and perfect settlement of the common border between British Guyana and Venezuela. Nothing could be more final. In the ensuing years, quickly after that, by 1905, the end of that decade, the boundary is demarcated on the ground. The teams of commissioners are nominated by Venezuela and the United Kingdom. Of course, Guyana was a British colony. There's an agreed boundary map. It's adopted. It's signed in Georgetown. This is a settled border. The southern border is also settled in this decade, again, subject to international arbitration undertaken by the King of Italy. So by 1905, Guyana's western border and southern border are internationally settled. 25 years later, Britain and Brazil formalized a boundary treaty. It's ratified in 1929, and then it's ground-truthed in 1936. We note that the Dutch boundary commissioners joined the team of British and Brazilian boundary commissioners when they marked the tri-junction point at the head of the East Scutari River. So by the time of the Second World War, the beginning in 1939, Britain was trying to settle, United Kingdom was trying to settle Guyana's borders. In that year, 1939, a draft treaty was submitted to the Netherlands, but the First World War intervened. So I'm going to switch over to the Suriname border very quickly. And what's interesting to me on this slide is that there are two periods when Dutch Guyana was under British rule, 1799 to 1802, and then 1804 to 1815. And the agreement that the Dutch should control, the Dutch Guyana should control, or the colony of Dutch Guyana, the Dutch colony should control the Quarantine River, was agreed by two Dutch governors in 1799 as a sort of a holding, just a holding, an interim measure until such time as the British, who were the colonial power, would decide on the boundary. In international law, it's customary that when there's a river which separates two nations, that the boundary is in the talweg, or the middle of the river, the deepest channel. Suriname becomes internally self-governing in 1954, and beginning in 1961, we see this astonishing demand again for changing the status quo and rejecting draft treaties. So there are a number of draft treaties. 1961, the United Kingdom submits a draft treaty to try and get the Guyana's eastern border settled. The Netherlands ignores that. In 1962, they reject the 1936 tri-junction point and claim Guyana's new river triangle, which had been ground-truthed in 1936. 1965, UK submits another draft treaty. Again, it's rejected by the Netherlands. And again, this unilateral claim to the New River Triangle. As in the case of Venezuela, there is no population, neither in Essequibo nor in the eastern part of Guyana, which says, we belong to Suriname or to Venezuela. The next section I'm quickly labeled petroleum politics leading to this Pincer movement from west to east. I develop petroleum politics more in next week's seminar, but it is certainly striking that in the aftermath of the Second World War, everything changes. So the settled border is a settled border is astonishingly rejected in 1962 by Venezuela, which disavows this international 1899 award. Astonishingly, the USA, which is, of course, by this stage, well entrenched in Venezuela in petroleum companies and petroleum extraction, allows this spurious claim to go through. USA, it's the Cold War. They're alarmed at the pro-Marxist PPP in Guyana. The United Kingdom is itself divesting itself of its colonies, or its colonies are agreeing to their independence in that period. Guyana is very much now on the eve of independence and isolated in this big power play. So now Venezuela is Goliath, and Guyana is very much David. And there is, at the same time, in 1962, these twin threats from Venezuela in the west and Suriname in the east, both countries perceiving this opportunity to take advantage of a departing great power, United Kingdom, or a major power, disavowing, in the case of Suriname, the previous bilateral negotiations, and of course, rejecting the draft treaties. I think the next section, which is the period of our independence, we see Guyana really, this emergence into a steadfast holding of its position. There is as far as Guyana maintains, there's a settled border, there's a controversy registered by Venezuela, diplomacy, in spite of the hostility of the United States and Venezuela, there's a steadfast hewing to diplomatic processes. The Geneva Agreement, which includes as well the Mixed Commission and confers on the Secretary General of the United Nations the power to choose a means of settlement if necessary. Again, and I make this point again, Venezuela produces during the life of that commission, Mixed Commission, nor in the following half century, no substantive evidence to confirm its territorial claim. Instead, what do we have? We have Venezuelan aggressions, the invasion of Guyana's half of Coco Island. We have the issuing of presidential decrees, the first one, which are declaring rights to the territorial sea. I'll talk about this next week. One first in 1968, and then more recently in May of 2015, when the presidential decree 1787 was seeking to create the Atlantic coast of Venezuela. But Guyana steadfastly plods along with the Mixed Commission and the series of good officers appointed by the UN Secretary General. This is a triumph for Guyana and for diplomacy. Venezuela's interests are explored in the short-lived Rupununi Uprising of 1969 in January. This is really a tear in the national fabric. It's an attempted secession by a small number of wealthy ranchers. The victims and the people who suffer are the Wapishan and Makushi peoples, who suffer the long-term consequences of coastlander distrust in the aftermath. On the eastern side, again, in addition to the hostility of the Venezuelans, there are aggressions from Suriname. In 1967, the Guyana Defense Force is able to evict a team of surveyors from the New River Triangle. 2 years later, GDF again drives out a Surinamese military contingent that was producing a base. As the Venezuelans do, Suriname begins producing maps showing New River Triangle as part of their national territory and badgering international organizations and companies to use those maps. So here we have both diplomatic hostility and illegal occupation, but the Guyana position, the GDF, and the government are able to keep this at bay. Those pressures accumulate in the ensuing decades. The US pressures against the Burnham-led administration against obtaining international credit. And part of our story is the way in which locally there is no national resonance on any of this, because already Guyana is in the throes of authoritarian domestic rule and rigging of elections. And this really colors the story or explains why David, the Guyana being David, is never able to sort of rally around the flag. The exclusions include Guyana being excluded from the OAS, not admitted until 1991, while on the other hand, 11 Caribbean territories, including Suriname, are admitted by 1984. Part of what I think we celebrate in Guyana is the leadership role in the Anglo-Caribbean sphere. Carifta, CARICOM, CARIFESTA, really are Guyana's response and ability to unite and have support, external support. Others, of course, Group of 77, which I don't have time to talk about. I shift now quickly to the era of Chavismo. I think this is a qualitative shift. In 2004, Chavez nationalizes oil, petroleum. He wants to have a greater role in Latin America and the Caribbean for his brand of leadership. ALBA is formed, the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas in 2004. 6 CARICOM nations, not Guyana, joined ALBA. A year later, Venezuela sets up PetroCaribe, which really is looking now to have oil, bartered oil, preferential prices for support for Venezuela's setting up this new alliance in the Caribbean. From Guyana's point of view, it's notable that in March 2006, Chavez issues a new national flag, which includes an 8-star, which he said represented the early 19th century eastern province of Guyana. The significance is not lost on Guyanese. However, Guyana benefits from the PetroCaribe scheme during the 10 years of its existence. We're bartering our cargo rights for oil on preferential terms. And this explains why when a Venezuelan military and civilian delegation, quote unquote, pay a visit to Eteringbang in Guyana, completely illegally, Mr. Juan Guaido included, the government's response is very muted because, of course, they don't want to upset these preferential arrangements. Not only Guyana is muted in its response to Venezuela, so is CARICOM's support at the end of meetings of heads of state in terms of their very coded language of expressing support for Guyana during the decade of PetroCaribe and ALBA. So I think the similarities in the playbook of Venezuela and Suriname are striking. Rejecting boundary commissions, in the case of Venezuela, rejecting a settled international treaty. Next week, I'll talk a bit about the rejection of the principle of equidistance in the territorial sea, issuing of unilateral national maps. These go against all international maps which are in existence, the gunboat aggressions by both countries. I'll talk about this next week, and playing the border controversy card to deflect from domestic dissatisfactions. So I should quickly really want to make an important point, which is that, yes, we've had diplomacy from Guyana's point, which is admirable, not celebrated enough. Yes, the Guyana Defense Force has played a huge role, but in my view, the Guyana's indigenous peoples were and remain the ultimate guarantors of Guyana's territorial integrity. This is a debt which is not explicitly acknowledged. And beginning to acknowledge this debt will begin to fulfill the political promises of nationhood, that rhetoric which we hear all the time. I show you quickly a map that shows Guyana's indigenous territories. You can see Region 1, Region 7, Region 8, Region 9. Indigenous peoples live close to the border areas. And so they are physically and in their communities, Guyana's first line of defense and protectors of sovereignty and property. On the east, here is Suriname, here is Oriala and Siparuta facing Suriname. Again, important outposts of Guyana's sovereignty. Guyanese Amerindians who serve in the Guyana Defense Force, the Marine Wing, play an outsized role in relation to their numbers. Their local knowledge, their discipline, their endurance I think, need to be celebrated more. So I think Guyana's land territory may be the topic of these twin controversies, but there is, importantly, no irredentist population which wants to join them. And yet the indigenous peoples' territories in Guyana, both titled and customary, are still invaded by minors. Successive governments have never been interested in applying the law and the constitution with respect to safeguarding indigenous territories. In areas which are titled, indigenous titled lands, they have no control over the road and river choke points in their titled lands. So it's right of way for anyone who wants to pass by, miners, loggers, sport fishers, whoever. Indigenous people do not enjoy a fixed part of the wealth that's extracted from their territories. And we get instead, polluting of rivers with mercury, and ludicrous press conferences. Oh, we've given black water tanks to some communities while destroying the lifeblood of Guyana. So just quickly to summarize, diplomacy, yes, governments have had a shared position to counter the Pincer movement. But I ask myself, why in Guyana these sustained external threats not brought us closer to national identity? Well, I think everyone in this call probably knows the answer. We've had centralization of power, authoritarian rule in single ethnic groups from independence, sadly, to now. History of rigged elections and contested elections. And after those elections, half of the population feels shut out. At the same time, the institutions that might have served us well have been destroyed, the civil service emasculated and just completely dismantled. Weak apolitical civic institutions, even in places where there's one ethnic group, and I know this from my own work, the ability of the political parties to destroy water users associations because they simply were not were seen as a possible threat to the power of political party organizations. So what we have in Guyana is the stranglehold of these two ethnic political parties that beat back any competing institutions. And so the real achievements of containing Venezuelan land incursions, repulsing Surinamese incursions during the Burnham era are did not lead to national identity and a sense of state formation. Similarly, when President Jagdeo had this huge success in 2007 at ECLOS that settled the eastern maritime boundary with Suriname, yes, billboards were put up, but we didn't have a national sense of shared pride. And I think this is said by many people, not just by me, that perhaps the ultimate hope would be that this really anachronistic term, mixed race, but it's part of our legal, our laws, the mixed race and the indigenous peoples will together, singly and together, force the warring tribes of Guyana into the collaborative processes we will need to survive the multiple challenges of the 21st century. All the press in many reports, they're always, let's look at Singapore and Mauritius, countries with the same ethnic groups as we have, and those who have surmounted their ethnic issues and tensions to build national societies. Those repeated calls continue to fall on deaf ears. And so now my final few minutes, I want to look at sovereignty devoid of safeguards for public institutions and public property. So I, like many Guyanese, I paid huge tribute to Dave Martin's, his wonderful song, Not a Blade of Grass. I think it's one of the few songs, one of the few, heartfelt bits of our shared culture, which has resonated with the majority of Guyanese, but that never gets taken up to a higher level. Maybe we're being drawn into the US sphere of influence. We don't have to look far to see why that's so. We can check ExxonMobil and what they hope to extract from Guyana's territory. The worry, of course, for Guyana in terms of sovereignty is that as royalties begin to flow into the treasury, we could go the way of other oil-producing countries where those royalties entrench one political party for 25 years at this head of government. That would be a matter of great, continue the instability and the lack of a national ethos in Guyana, were we were to go the way of Equatorial Guinea, for example. So when I say here that sovereignty is not the same of property, 85% of Guyana's landmass is state property. And when we look at the privatizing, which has gone on, which goes on and continues to go on with our public property, the approach of the successive administrations to this privatizing of public property at rock bottom prices, bringing very little minimal benefits to Guyana as a nation. the approach of successive governments is like, you're not going to leave something for them by. In other words, as if we were beggars. We have never negotiated fair returns to the Guyanese people and to its exchequer from this privatizing, allowing our public property, 83%, that is both de jure and de facto, in the hands of a small clique of Guyanese and foreigners as well. In the legislation, the massive Guyanese who are in gold mining areas are legally termed tributors. They are not subjects. They are still subjects. They are not citizens. If you discuss this in Guyana, as I have tried to do, if depending on the ethnic ethnic affiliation or of the person you're talking to, if you're talking about government or administration to which they uphold, they'll say alman a thief. In other words, everybody does it. So we can let that go on. They're never going to criticize who they see as their the political party that safeguards their interests. This is a rentier approach, which allows this to continue. There's a tradition in the successive administrations to sign these contracts that are written by incoming investors. Most people have seen the Barama contract, ExxonMobil. We know the astonishing clauses for 40 years, which are locked us into penury. And so these dominant roles, which are played by multinational companies, do not evoke the responsiveness which we might think we could have because we've been threatened on both sides of our borders. Why? Because we're divided along racial lines, and that allows poor governmental performance to continue. So here are my concluding thoughts. Other countries have gone through these interethnic conflagrations. And other countries, I mentioned Singapore, I mentioned Malaysia, they've emerged with at least partial democracy and at least a nascent social contract. They've emerged with a sense of the value of a professional civil service. Look at Rwanda, and an appreciation of the value of learning from other countries. I'm not going to end with doom and gloom. I think we are on that path. We're already part of a movement that should help this process along. I think the anti-money laundering legislation is a good step. When the regulations are written and debated and enforced, that will allow us to trace the movement of money. EITI, as Kiteshore News points out, when Guyana will have to report, we'll see who are the beneficial owners of Guyana's public wealth, now privatized. Similarly, with the Forest Law Enforcement, Governance and Trade, if that is upheld, and the UN Conventions on Human Rights, which requires states parties to report at 5-year periods. So thank you, everyone, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Janet, for a really terrific presentation. I particularly appreciated that question that apparently was an organizing theme in your presentation, a novel one, for me anyway. Namely, why is it that these external threats have not shaped a national identity? As we wait for persons to add their questions and comments, and I see there's already some persons are beginning to get engaged. I want to reflect a little bit on this question that you asked, you posed this afternoon. In my head, I'm going through some stylized facts about Guyana, namely that we're part of this Amazonia region, and we're part of this large, vast area of the Guyanas that at another level is really seamless and has no regard for political boundaries. Those political boundaries are artifacts of the imagination of human beings. Another stylized fact is that the large areas over which there is dispute tend to be the areas that are not particularly populated by the two major ethnic groups. Another stylized fact is the, shall we say, the deformities in our politics that's closely connected to our ethnic fractionalization at one level. Whenever I say that, I like to see as well that at a different level, shall we say, at a more meaningful level, that sort of fractionalization doesn't really exist. So all of these things have gone through my head, and as an economist, it was difficult for me to grapple with it all. But Janet, that question came back and helped me to think through something. My question to you, therefore, would be, is there some relationship between the fact that, well, the disputed areas also happen to be public property, that perhaps we Guyanese only have a sense of ownership of, I'm speaking loosely here about major ethnic groups, only have a sense of ownership over, and rightly so, this narrow coastal plain where we do have property rights and we do have a sense of actual ownership. And that the fact that, well, the disputed area